16 men are crawling through the dark. It's just past 11 at night, July 6th, 1944. Somewhere ahead of them, hidden inside a tangle of hedgerows, the GIs have started calling Kraut Corner. German machine gunners are waiting behind walls of packed earth and root, walls that have already swallowed 2 American patrols whole. Every man in this file knows what happened to those patrols. They crawl anyway. Above them, American artillery is screaming into the same patch of ground they're about to walk into. A deliberate, timed barrage, laid down so its noise will cover the sound of their approach. First Lieutenant Ralph Winstead is at the front. Behind him, satchel charges and Bangalore torpedoes are being passed hand to hand in the dark, men who can't see each other's faces trusting each other with explosives that could kill them all if one goes wrong. They are not supposed to win this. Twice already, this exact position has chewed up American patrols and sent the survivors crawling back the way they came. The smart move, the safe move, is to pull back, report what little you know, and let the next plan handle it. This squad does not pull back. Nobody here is a hero out of a movie. Most of these men have been in France for less than a month. Some of them are still carrying rifles left over from the last war their fathers fought. They are cold, they are exhausted, and every one of them has watched friends die trying to do exactly what they're doing right now. And still, in the dark, they keep crawling forward. This is the story of the fight for Hill 192, the ground the Germans needed to hold and the Americans could not afford to lose. It's a story about what happens when an army that was never trained for this kind of war refuses to accept the answer it's being given and does something the enemy never planned for. It adapts in the middle of the fighting and keeps coming. If you want more true stories like this one, verified, sourced, and told the way they actually happened, this channel is where you'll find them. Hit subscribe before we go any further, because where this story is headed, you won't want to miss what comes next. 4 miles east of the town of St. Lo, in the Norman countryside of France, there's a low rise of ground that barely qualifies as a hill by any ordinary measure. It climbs gently from the north, steeper on its eastern and southern faces, thick with orchards and patches of forest. On a map, it's marked simply by its height in meters, 192. In June of 1944, that gentle slope was the single most valuable piece of real estate in the entire American sector of Normandy. From its crest, an observer could see for miles in every direction, every road, every crossroads, every American column moving up from the beaches. Whoever held Hill 192 could call down artillery on anything that moved below it. And in the summer of 1944, the men holding it were soldiers of the German 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division. Paratroopers, elite light infantry, dug into a landscape that might have been designed for exactly this kind of fighting. The bocage of Normandy is not what most Americans pictured when they thought of French farmland. These weren't decorative hedges. They were earthen walls, built up over centuries by farmers clearing stone from their fields, topped with dense brush and root systems thick enough to stop a rifle bullet cold. Every field was its own fortress, walled on all sides, connected by narrow sunken lanes where the tree branches met overhead and hid everything from the sky. An attacker crossing one of those fields was exposed from the moment he stepped into the open. A defender inside the hedge was invisible until he chose to open fire. One American general who fought through this terrain later said he found it worse ground to attack across than anything he'd seen fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, because at least in the jungle, the man attacking had some cover too. Here, the advantage belonged entirely to whoever was already dug in and waiting. The paratroopers holding Hill 192 understood this terrain better than anyone. Many of them had trained in this exact kind of country before the invasion. Each of their rifle companies carried 20 MG-42 machine guns and dozens of submachine guns. A staggering concentration of automatic fire for a unit that size. Every mortar tube on the hill had been pre-registered, meaning the Germans already knew exactly where their shells would land before the first American ever crossed the line of departure. This wasn't a position the Americans could simply walk into and take. It was a machine built to kill anyone who tried. The men assigned to take it were soldiers of the Second Infantry Division, the Indian Head Division, named for the full head-dressed warrior stitched onto their shoulder patch. And for most of them, Hill 192 would be their very first experience of ground combat in this war. They had trained for years, in Northern Ireland and then in England, right up until the weeks before the invasion. They had never done this. Their commanders had never led men into this kind of ground before either. And the plan for taking Hill 192 was assembled by officers who, by their own later admission, briefed the attack from well behind the lines, describing terrain they had never personally walked and could not actually see. Taking that hill wasn't optional. General Bradley needed the flank it protected secured before he could safely push toward the vital crossroads town of St. Lo, and St. Lo itself was the hinge on which the entire Allied breakout from Normandy would eventually turn. Every day the hill stayed in German hands was another day American movement below it could be watched, targeted, and shelled at will. The attack began before dawn on June 12, 1944. American artillery opened up at 5:40 in the morning, and then the infantry went forward. Company F led the way, and it did not get far. Rifle fire, mortar fire, and interlocking machine gun fire cut into the advancing lines almost immediately. The battalion commander sent another company around the flank to keep the momentum going. The German fire only grew heavier. By the end of that single day, the 2nd Battalion of the 23rd Infantry Regiment alone had lost 211 men, killed or wounded. Tanks that tried to climb over the hedgerows exposed their thin belly armor and were destroyed by German anti-tank rockets fired from point-blank range out of the brush. Tanks that stayed on the sunken lanes became stuck, easy targets in terrain too narrow to maneuver or even turn around in. American artillery observers, unable to see through the thick hedgerow country, often couldn't even locate what they were supposed to be shooting at, so shells fell on suspected positions rather than confirmed ones, a guessing game played with high explosive. Late that night, the Germans counterattacked, as they always did after losing ground, except this time they hadn't lost any. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness on both sides as men fired blindly at movement, at sound, at anything. The battalion commander lay awake, wondering whether what he'd just survived was the real German counterattack or only a probe ahead of something larger still to come. It never came. The Americans dug in where they stood and waited for the next order. It arrived 4 days later, on June 16th. The result was the same, only slower and more exhausting to watch unfold. Companies advanced into withering fire, gained a field here, a hedgerow there, and were thrown back by German counterattacks before they could consolidate what little ground they'd taken. One rifle company actually fought its way to the crest of Hill 192, close enough to see the whole of the American beachhead spread out behind them, and then lost the position again within hours, driven back down the slope they'd just bled for. Engineers were pulled from their normal duties and thrown into the line as infantry just to hold what remained of the front. After 4 days of fighting, the attack was called off entirely. The cost, somewhere between 200 and 1,250 American casualties, for a hill the Americans still did not hold. This is the part of the story most documentaries skip past, but it's the part that matters most, because what happened next wasn't a lucky break. It was a choice. For nearly a month, the 2nd Division sat in position below Hill 192, taking occasional artillery fire, and did something the German command likely never anticipated. It studied its own failure. Officers went back over every stage of the attack. They realized their reconnaissance had been inadequate. Commanders had planned the assault without ever laying eyes on the ground they were sending men across. They realized their coordination with tanks was almost non-existent, because most of these infantry units had never trained alongside armor before landing in France. They realized their automatic weapons were outmatched, man for man, by the German MG-42 teams waiting in every hedgerow. So they fixed it. Engineers experimented with ways to blow gaps through hedgerows without wasting enormous quantities of explosive. Armored bulldozers were brought up. A sergeant from a cavalry reconnaissance squadron, Curtis Cullen, welded scavenged steel into a set of prongs and bolted them to the front of a tank, creating a machine that could tear straight through a hedgerow instead of climbing helplessly over it and exposing its belly. Soon these modified tanks were being called rhinos, and every unit that could get its hands on the steel wanted a set. Infantry, armor, and combat engineers began training together for the first time, building small assault teams, a rifle squad paired with a single tank and a handful of engineers, learning each other's hand signals, learning how to talk to a tank commander buttoned up inside his hull with a soldier walking 20 feet away in the open. Replacements arrived to fill the gaps left by June, and the hardest-hit companies absorbed them and kept training. Better patrols went out ahead of the lines to map exactly where German strongpoints sat, because the officers now understood that no plan drawn up miles behind the front could substitute for a soldier who had actually walked the ground. None of this happened because someone in the rear ordered it and everyone simply complied. It happened because men who had just watched their friends die for nothing were furious enough and stubborn enough to insist on doing it differently the next time. And while the planners refined their tactics in the rear, individual soldiers kept probing the German position on their own initiative, in the dark, alone, not waiting for the next big coordinated push to test what the Germans were still capable of. That's what brought 16 men crawling toward Kraut Corner on the night of July 6th. Every previous patrol that had gone near this stretch of hedgerow had been shot to pieces before it got close. Winstead's patrol moved differently. They used the sound of their own artillery, timed to hammer the German position, as cover for their approach, walking forward under a barrage that was, by design, meant to keep German heads down at the exact moment American boots were closing the distance. They crept to within yards of the enemy trenches before anyone inside knew they were there. Then the satchel charges went off. In the chaos and concussion of the blast, Winstead's men broke straight into the German position and fought it out at point-blank range. Rifles, grenades, bayonets, men close enough to see the faces of the soldiers they were fighting. When it was over, the patrol had inflicted roughly 11 German casualties against 3 of their own, and they walked out with something far more valuable than a body count. A precise, first-hand map of exactly where the German machine guns and mortars were dug in, information that would matter enormously in the days ahead. It was around this same stretch of fighting that one soldier's private war became legend inside the Second Division. Technical Sergeant Frank Kwiatek was a First World War veteran, older than most of the men around him, carrying grief that had nothing to do with Hill 192. Both of his brothers had been killed fighting in Italy in a different army's campaign, a different stretch of hell entirely. Kwiatek made himself a promise anyway, 25 German dead for each of them. He didn't carry the standard-issue M1 Garand that most of his division had only recently been given. Kwiatek fought with an old bolt-action Springfield rifle fitted with a telescopic sight, the same type of weapon he'd likely carried a generation earlier in the First War. There was something almost deliberate in that choice. A soldier from one world war reaching for its rifle to settle accounts in the next one. Day after day, he stalked the hedgerows around Hill 192 alone, moving quietly from position to position, picking off German riflemen one at a time. 21 of them, by the count that survives. Most of these men were labeled snipers in the reports written afterward, though it's worth being honest here. Contemporary American accounts openly admit that many of the Germans killing GIs from concealed positions in these hedgerows were not trained marksmen at all. They were ordinary infantrymen, carrying standard bolt-action Mausers, hidden in terrain that made every rifleman look like a sniper to the man pinned down in the open field below him. To the Americans lying in the dirt with bullets snapping past, the distinction hardly mattered. What mattered was that someone unseen, somewhere in that hedge, was trying to kill them, and one American, working alone with an obsolete rifle and a promise he'd made to 2 dead brothers, kept finding a way to kill them first. Kwiatek was wounded during this stretch of fighting. He came back. He killed 15 more. He became the first soldier in the entire Second Infantry Division to be awarded the Silver Star, a single man's private campaign of vengeance, folded into a much larger battle most of his own division never fully knew about until later. By July 10th, the pieces were finally in place for a second attempt at the hill, and this one would look almost nothing like the first. The plan called for the 38th Infantry Regiment to take the crest of Hill 192 directly, while the 23rd Infantry attacked in the center. And this time, nobody was improvising. Combat engineers, tank crews, and infantry squads had spent weeks training as single integrated teams. Sherman tanks were fitted with field telephones wired to their rear hull, so that an infantryman walking alongside could pick up a handset and talk directly to the men buttoned up inside, pointing out a machine gun slit in a bunker wall, a rifleman in a window, a threat the tank crew couldn't see through their narrow vision slits. At dawn on July 11th, more than 25,000 artillery rounds fell on the German positions in the space of 60 minutes, the heaviest concentration of American artillery fire seen in the fighting for Normandy up to that point. Survivors who staggered out of their positions afterward were often too stunned by the shelling to resist. Then the infantry moved. This time, when a hedgerow erupted with German automatic fire, it didn't stop the advance. It triggered the plan. Engineers moved up and blew a gap through the earthen wall, or a rhino tank simply put its prongs down and tore straight through. The tank rolled into the gap, firing its main gun into the far corners of the field where German gun crews traditionally hid. Riflemen surged through behind it, throwing grenades ahead of them into the next line of hedges before the defenders could recover. It wasn't clean. It wasn't easy. Some of the tanks, loaded with extra demolition charges strapped to their rear decks for the engineers, were destroyed outright when hot shrapnel from tree bursts set the explosives off, turning a support vehicle into a fireball in seconds. One company took so many casualties it had to be pulled from the line entirely. Its survivors folded into another unit just to keep the advance moving. To the east, at a defile the GIs had already started calling Purple Heart Draw. Men were caught in murderous crossfire and paid for every yard in blood, while nearby, another company found the going easier and used rifle grenades to knock out one German machine gun nest after another. Low cloud and fog grounded the spotter planes for most of the morning, taking away the eyes in the sky the Americans had been counting on. And when a rare gap in the weather let a strike go in, it landed on American troops by mistake, forcing commanders to cancel further air support rather than risk it happening again. Through it all, the tank infantry engineer teams kept working the way they'd trained. Artillery lifting, hedgerow erupting, the gap blown or torn open, the tank rolling through firing at the far corners of the field, riflemen pouring in behind it before the defenders could reorganize. Field by field, the advance chewed forward. An armored dozer operator buried 3 German gunners alive under the collapsed wall of a hedgerow they'd been firing from. A lieutenant talked one German soldier into leading him to 7 more hiding positions, taking prisoners without firing another shot. None of it was glorious. All of it worked. But field by field, hedgerow by hedgerow, the Americans kept moving forward, and this time they didn't stop. By late afternoon on July 11th, the defenders on Hill 192 had been hit so hard for so many consecutive hours that when they finally broke and pulled back, they didn't even manage the counterattack the Germans had launched after every previous American gain. There was nothing left to counterattack with. American troops crossed the St. Lo Bayou Highway at the base of the hill under fire, and by nightfall, the high ground that had dominated the entire sector for a month belonged to the Second Infantry Division. The fighting wasn't quite finished. The next morning, the division pushed the last German resistance off the position entirely, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The hill that had cost well over 1,000 American casualties in June had fallen in a single day of coordinated disciplined violence in July. This time the cost was 69 killed, 328 wounded, 8 missing, a fraction of what the same objective had demanded a month earlier. What happened on Hill 192 mattered far beyond one stretch of Norman farmland. With the high ground finally in American hands, the path to St. Lo itself lay open. The capture of the town, weeks of brutal hedgerow fighting later, would give General Bradley the platform he needed to launch Operation Cobra, the breakout that finally tore the Allied armies free of the Normandy beachhead and sent them racing across France. But the deeper legacy of Hill 192 isn't a line on a map. It's what happened inside the men who fought there between the failure of June 16th and the dawn of July 11th. An army that had never fought this kind of war looked directly at its own defeat, refused to accept it as the final answer, and rebuilt its own tactics in the field, under fire, in less than a month. A 16-man patrol crawled toward a position that had already broken 2 others before it, and didn't turn back. A grieving sergeant picked up an obsolete rifle and turned his own private war into a small, devastating campaign that outlasted a wound and kept going. None of them waited for permission to stop being afraid. They simply decided that retreat wasn't the answer they were willing to give. That is the real story German commanders never fully accounted for in the summer of 1944. Not some mythical, uncontrollable American aggression, but something far more dangerous to an enemy relying on doctrine and discipline. An army willing to fail, learn, and come back harder, one hedgerow at a time, until the high ground simply couldn't be held anymore. Historians studying this campaign have pointed to Hill 192 as one of the clearest examples of that adaptability in the entire Normandy fighting. Proof that American soldiers, however green, however unprepared for this specific kind of war when they landed, could absorb a brutal lesson and apply it within weeks rather than years. The Germans who fought them, veterans of far longer campaigns, had counted on doctrine and discipline to hold the advantage. What they ran into instead was something harder to plan against, an enemy that treated its own failure as information, not defeat. Hill 192 doesn't have a monument most people have ever heard of. Most Americans could not point to it on a map. Today it's quiet farmland again, horses grazing where Frank Fiatek once lay for hours with his brother's names in his head and a rifle in his hands, where a 16-man patrol once crawled through the dark toward a position that had already broken 2 others before it. But for 1 month in the summer of 1944, that gentle, unremarkable rise of ground held the fate of an entire campaign. The men who took it were not supermen. They were frightened, cold, and grieving, thrown into a kind of fighting nobody back home had fully prepared them for. And they earned every foot of that hill the hard way, refusing, again and again, to give the enemy the retreat he was counting on. If this story moved you, there are more like it waiting on this channel, real, documented, told the way these men earned to have it told. Subscribe, hit that bell so you don't miss the next one, and if you know someone who'd want to hear this story, send it to them. These men didn't ask to be forgotten. The least we can do is make sure they aren't.